I'm the co-producer of Prisoners of the Moon and co-writer. I came up with a courtroom drama actually based on the immigration tribunal of Arthur Rudolph. And in 2016, I met with Johnny Gogan, the director, and we decided that that script would make a nice sort of spine, I suppose, for a drama documentary. And so off we went. I covered a number of commercial rocket launches. These were carrying television satellites up into orbit, and these are very much the same kind of rockets as the Saturn V that launched Apollo, took Apollo to the moon. And so for background for those articles, I came to know about Wernher von Braun and a number of the other Germans that had been involved in the wartime V2 missile program and then were immigrated to the United States in 1945 to work in the Cold War from America's point of view, and then ended up in NASA and crucial to the moonshot. I mean, the other thing that made me interested in this story, having written about rockets as a journalist, and then this story of Wernher von Braun, etc., being to some extent kidnapped by American, intelligence and taken there. And when I say kidnapped, I mean, in competition with the British and the French and the Soviets, who were all crawling all over Germany as it was defeated, trying to get hold of what they called intellectual reparations. I mean, they recognized that Germany was going to be completely bankrupt after the war, so there wouldn't be any financial reparations. And so there were these supposedly cooperating operations to find machinery, documentation, and personnel that could bring to the Allied countries the technologies where they knew that the Germans were ahead. And obviously rockets was one of those where they were very much ahead. Jet engines was another, and various pharmaceutical things. And as it happens, one of my grandfathers was an industrial chemist who was seconded into the kind of British part of this effort in 1945. Now, he spent about 6 weeks in Germany, with a unit that followed the kind of advancing front line down. And there's one picture of him outside of a destroyed Lindt chocolate factory, from which I don't know what he learnt. And as far as we know, nothing dramatic happened, and he came home after about 6 weeks. But it was that kind of link, that led me to write a book in 2009, and the 40th anniversary of the moon landing. And it was because I'd done that book that I knew about this tribunal, and a few years later I got around to getting hold of the transcript and writing the courtroom drama that ended up at the heart of this film. Arthur Rudolph was effectively the number 2 to Wernher von Braun in the Saturn V program, but he was also number 2 to Wernher von Braun in the V2 missile program. And he was, he retired in 1969, covered in glory, awarded NASA's highest medal, and he'd been in charge of the Saturn V project. However, he then became the only one of all of the German engineers and scientists who immigrated to the US to be charged with war crimes. Now, in fact, he ended up doing a sort of plea bargain deal with the FBI in 1983 and agreed to be stripped of his US citizenship and deported to Germany. He came to regret that decision, particularly when he found that the FBI didn't actually charge anybody else. And he decided to try and come back into the United States, to be honest, in something of a publicity stunt, via Canada. And he landed in Toronto in July 1990, but the FBI had been tipped off, and he was arrested at the airport and then put in front of a Canadian immigration tribunal. Now, that became the only place in which all of the issues actually to do with these scientists being immigrated in 1945 in the first place, and then to do with the way that he was deported in 1983, were aired in public. Now, I got a hold of the transcript of that tribunal and sort of rendered from that a courtroom drama, and that's where the film really started. Well, we felt that was the best way to tell the story. Of course, Rudolph's not around anymore, and nor of a number of other characters. But also the courtroom kind of ebbed and flowed. I mean, it was certainly not the case that the FBI had an open and shut case against Rudolph back in 1983. Certainly many would claim that the reason they did a plea bargain rather than bring it to trial was they couldn't be sure of winning a trial. And certainly Rudolph had a number of supporters, you know, inside and outside of American politics, who felt his constitutional rights had been infringed, and that it was at the very least ungrateful of the US to deport somebody who'd given 38 years service to the military and then to NASA. And in fact, the smoking gun evidence that was probably the best evidence against Rudolph didn't actually emerge until this tribunal was going on in 1990. So it offers you great drama in terms of the prosecution and then the defense ebbing and flowing, and then the revelation of this smoking gun evidence. Now, alongside that, of course, we could also tell the story via testimony from Jean-Michel, who was a surviving slave laborer from the Mittelwerk, which was this underground factory in the middle of Germany that built the V2 rockets, and also archive material. And I think this allows us to tell the story without narration, and means that the viewer can see it from many perspectives. I think it has things to say in terms of you know, the old adage and the dangers in the old adage of my enemy's enemy is my friend, which was certainly very much the attitude that the American military and the American Defense Department took in 1945. By the time the war was coming to an end in the Pacific, the sort of nascent CIA, as it was in those days, had already decided that the Soviets were the new enemy. And anything that they could do and anything that they could get from Germany that would help them to fight that war was legitimate. And also, I think in these days of you know, technological development, all of us as data points to be dealt in by technological companies, you know, many of whom a few years ago we perhaps would all have believed in terms of their mantras of do no evil, etc. I think we can come to see that there's still a strong message that if you develop technology in a moral vacuum, then that is always going to lead to perhaps unintended but often not good consequences. It's another important part of the story. You know, we're also familiar with the story of the final solution these days, but it didn't really figure in American public discourse until the late 70s. You know, I think because the Cold War was so front and center as a priority, it wasn't until really the campaigning work of Congresswoman Elizabeth Holtzman, still a very campaigning politician in America to this day, and taken up by what we now call traditional media, in particular the New York Times, that you know, the story that there were former Nazis living and working in America became known, and it was decided through what was called the Office of Special Investigations as part of the FBI to look into it. Now, Rudolph and von Braun and you know, several hundred other colleagues that were brought in both for the missile program and also notoriously in the pharmaceutical and the medical industries, couldn't deny that they were Nazis, not least because their Nazi membership cards were generally speaking in their files, although part of the story is the way in which their files were edited in order to get them into the United States in the first place. But they were presented by the American military and defense establishment as good Germans, you know, as our Germans. And okay, they were Nazis, but then, you know, you had to be in the Nazi party. You didn't have really much choice about that. And in order to get anything done, you had to be a member of the Nazi party. And there's some truth in that. And the other thing that, of course, Nazis were genuinely claim, and chimed very much with the kind of McCarthyite atmosphere of early 1950s America, was that they were anti-communist or anti-Bolshevik, as they'd have said back in the 1930s. In other words, we supported Hitler because the alternative seemed to be that the Bolsheviks would take over. Now, of course, there's a difference between being a kind of a reluctant member, potentially, of the Nazi Party, and being an enthusiastic member. And in fact, Arthur Rudolph, for example, joined in 1931, quite a long time before it would have become politically convenient to join. He was also a member of the SA, which is a kind of a paramilitary version of the SS. And he was an officer in the SS itself, as indeed was Werner von Braun. So, you know, you can look at the evidence yourself and decide for yourself, but there certainly is evidence that a number of these people, including Arthur Rudolph, they weren't just Nazis, they were active and indeed enthusiastic Nazis. And specifically, active Nazis should not have been allowed into America in 1945 by direct presidential order. And there is little doubt that the US intelligence community deliberately covered up the facts of their history in order that they could avoid what was essentially American law. We decided to go for you know, a black box style, if you like, in which we're not pretending that this is an exact replica of what happened. It is an exact replica of what happened in the sense that all of the dialogue is a very faithful rendering of exactly what was said in the transcript. In terms of the cast, we got very lucky that you know, we wanted to get Jim Norton, a very fine, very experienced actor, but also somebody who bears you know, a really true resemblance to Arthur Rudolph. And Jim read the script and luckily for us thought it was, you know, a very interesting story that he was very happy to take part in. You have to, you know, you have to have a good story and you have to believe in that story, and then you just have to persist. You know, I mean, most things are a blend of inspiration, perspiration, and persistence. And in some ways, certainly in filmmaking, I think persistence is the most important. And get other people like, you know, Johnny, the director, and others to believe in it too. And also just do it. You know, I mean, before we had a penny of third-party funding, because you can do it cheaply if you choose to. You know, Johnny and I just got on a plane with a camera and went to the States and interviewed the chief war crimes prosecutor of the United States, you know, in the Department of Justice. You know, interviewed the head of the rocket department at the Smithsonian in his office, and then drove down to Alabama. I actually took a train, which is a film in itself, down to Alabama to film, you know, around the rocket sites in Huntsville and talk to a few people down there. So we had what ended up probably being 20–25% of the finished film, you know, in the can, whatever that was, 2 years ago, without knowing whether we'd actually end up making a film. So I think at the end of the day, you give yourself momentum by just going and doing as much as you can, as soon as you can.